At Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, my mother-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're unworthy of my son, a nobody in a thrift store dress." The words sliced through the air like a knife, silencing the chatter of 25 elite guests who'd gathered to celebrate James's promotion. Crystal glasses froze halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the waiters stopped moving. What happened next didn't just shock that room full of Manhattan's finest. It changed everything they thought they knew about worth, power, and the woman they'd spent 3 years looking down on. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they had you all figured out? Drop a comment below and hit that like button, because what I'm about to tell you will make you believe in the power of keeping your cards close to your chest. Now, let's rewind to the cracked sidewalks of Queens, where I learned the greatest lesson of my life. Worth isn't defined by what you wear, but by what you're willing to fight for. My name is Mia Carter, and I'm 32 years old. 10 years ago, I created an algorithm worth $10 million from my studio apartment in Queens, and I've been hiding it ever since. But let me start at the beginning. In the cramped walk-up above Chen's Laundromat on Northern Boulevard, where the smell of industrial detergent mixed with my mother's vanilla candles and the sound of sirens was our nightly lullaby. My mother, Lorraine, worked the graveyard shift at Mel's all-night diner, coming home at dawn with coffee-stained uniforms and pockets full of crumpled singles. She'd count those tips at our kitchen table while I ate cereal from mismatched bowls, dividing them into piles labeled rent, groceries, and if we were lucky, movies. "Education is your ticket out, baby girl," she'd tell me, dark circles under her eyes making her look older than her 35 years. "Nobody can take your brains away from you." So I studied like my life depended on it because it did. While other kids played video games, I devoured library books and taught myself programming languages from outdated computer manuals. The Flushing Branch librarian, Mrs. Park, would save the newest coding books for me, slipping them across the circulation desk with a conspiratorial wink. By 16, I was building websites for local businesses, earning enough to buy my first laptop, a refurbished ThinkPad that overheated if you ran too many programs at once. But it was mine, and on that machine, I wrote the code that would eventually change everything. The NYU scholarship letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, thin envelope that made my stomach drop until I opened it and saw the word "Congratulations" in bold letters. Full ride, computer science program. 4 years of opportunity I never could have afforded. I found my mother crying at the kitchen table when I showed her the letter, happy tears mixing with exhaustion as she pulled me into a hug that smelled like coffee and hope. College was a revelation: access to high-speed internet, state-of-the-art labs, professors who saw potential instead of poverty. I absorbed everything like a sponge, staying up until 3 a.m. perfecting algorithms while my roommates partied in the dorms I couldn't afford to live in. Senior year, during an advanced machine learning course, I stumbled onto something extraordinary. A pattern recognition algorithm that could predict market fluctuations with unprecedented accuracy. My professor, Dr. Martinez, took one look at my code and whistled low. "Mia, this is remarkable. Have you considered patent applications? Venture capital funding?" But I was terrified. Terrified of the spotlight, of the pressure, of becoming someone I didn't recognize. So, at 22, I quietly sold my algorithm to a hedge fund for $10 million, signing non-disclosure agreements that buried my name so deep even Google couldn't find it. Instead of buying penthouses or sports cars, I put $9 million in conservative investments and lived off the interest. I rented a modest studio apartment in Astoria, got a job as a paralegal at a small firm, and told everyone I was paying off student loans like everybody else. The secret felt like armor protecting me from people who might love my money more than they loved me, shielding me from a world where worth was measured in zeros and commas instead of character and kindness. That's how I was living when I met James Prescott at the Children's Hospital Charity Gala 3 years ago. I'd bought my ticket with guilt money, $50 from my real bank account, while sitting on millions nobody knew about. The Metropolitan Museum was transformed into a wonderland of soft lighting and classical music. Women in designer gowns floating between auction displays like expensive butterflies. I stood near the silent auction tables in my department store dress, bidding on weekend spa packages I couldn't technically afford, when someone behind me said, "The photography lessons are a better investment." I turned to find a man about my age with kind eyes and a smile that reached all the way to his temples. Tall, dark hair slightly mussed like he'd been running his hands through it, wearing a tuxedo that fit him perfectly but looked like an afterthought. "James Prescott," he said, extending his hand. "And you're either very good at hiding your wealth or very bad at pretending you belong here." "Mia Carter," I replied, liking his directness. "And I'm definitely the latter." We spent the evening talking about everything except money, his work as a pediatric surgeon, my love of vintage movies, our shared belief that the best conversations happen in hospital cafeterias at 2 a.m. He didn't name drop or flash expensive watches. He talked about patience and purpose, about wanting to use his privilege for something meaningful. "Want to get coffee sometime?" he asked as the gala wound down. "Somewhere that doesn't require formal wear?" Our first date was at a diner in Queens, my suggestion, his enthusiastic agreement. We talked until the waitress started stacking chairs, and I found myself falling for a man who chose pancakes over pretension, who listened more than he spoke, who seemed genuinely interested in the person I was, instead of the person I might become. It took 6 months before he brought me home to meet his parents. The Prescott estate in Greenwich was everything I'd expected, and dreaded manicured lawns, circular driveway, the kind of house that appeared in architectural magazines. James's mother, Evelyn, greeted us at the front door wearing pearls at 2 p.m. on a Saturday and a smile that never reached her eyes. "So you're Mia," she said, her voice carrying the kind of judgment that comes from never having to question your own worth. "James has told us so much about you." The way she said much suggested it hadn't been flattering. Dinner was an exercise in subtle interrogation questions about my background, my education, my career prospects that felt more like a job interview for a position I hadn't applied for. James tried to redirect conversations, but his mother had the persistence of a prosecutor and the manners to make her hostility seem like concern. "It must be challenging," she said over the soup course, balancing a relationship with someone from James's background. Such different worlds, really. I smiled and nodded, and played the role of the grateful girlfriend honored to be included. But inside, something hardened. I'd spent my life being underestimated, and Evelyn Prescott had just added herself to a very long list. 3 weeks later, the cream-colored invitation arrived at my apartment, heavy cardstock with embossed lettering that screamed old money and older traditions. "The pleasure of your company is requested for a family dinner honoring James's recent appointment as Chief of Pediatric Surgery." My hands trembled as I read the guest list, 25 names that read like a who's who of Manhattan society. Judges, politicians, fellow surgeons whose opinions could make or break careers. This wasn't a celebration. This was a test. The elevator opened directly into their foyer. No hallway, no modest entrance, just instant immersion into a space that screamed generational wealth. Marble floors stretched toward floor-to-ceiling windows that framed Central Park like a living painting. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead like frozen fireworks, and every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. "Impressive, isn't it?" James said, his voice carrying a mix of pride and embarrassment as he watched me take it all in. I forget sometimes how overwhelming it can be. That's when Evelyn Prescott appeared, gliding across the marble like she was floating rather than walking. She wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my annual rent, Her silver hair swept into a perfect chignon that hadn't moved since 1985. When she smiled, it was with her mouth, only her gray eyes remained cold as January morning. "Mia, darling," she said, air kissing my cheeks with lips that never quite made contact. "Welcome to our home. James has told us so much about you." The way she emphasized so much made it sound like a medical diagnosis rather than an introduction. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Prescott. Your home is beautiful." "Prescott. Family tradition," she replied, gesturing toward oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. 4 generations of careful curation, each piece chosen not just for beauty, but for pedigree. The word hung in the air between us like a challenge. In Evelyn's world, pedigree wasn't just about breeding, it was about proving you belonged in spaces like this, among people like them. Cocktails were served in the library, a wood-paneled room lined with leather-bound first editions that looked more decorative than red. James's father, William, emerged from behind the Wall Street Journal long enough to shake my hand with the enthusiasm of a man greeting his tax attorney. "So, Mia," Evelyn said, settling into a wingback chair that looked like a throne, "James tells us you work at a law firm. How industrious of you." The pause before industrious was surgical in its precision, designed to highlight that I worked for money rather than passion or purpose. "I'm a paralegal at Morrison & Associates," I said, accepting the crystal glass James offered me. "We focus on family law, custody cases mostly. It's rewarding work." "I'm sure it is," Evelyn replied with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, "though I imagine the compensation must be rather modest. Especially in New York, where everything is so expensive." James shifted beside me, his jaw tightening with the first signs of tension. "Mom, Mia's work is important. She helps families navigate some of the most difficult times in their lives." "Of course, darling. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise, but her tone suggested exactly that. I simply find it curious when people choose such challenging paths, especially when there might be easier alternatives. The conversation continued like a tennis match where only one person knew the rules. Evelyn would serve up questions disguised as concern about my education, my background, my long-term goals, while I struggled to return shots that wouldn't reveal how outmatched I was. "Your family must be so proud," she said, studying me over the rim of her martini glass. "What do your parents do?" "My mother works at a diner in Queens," I said, refusing to be ashamed of Lorraine's honest work. "She's been there 15 years. "How authentic," Evelyn murmured, the word dripping with condescension. "And your father?" "He's not in the picture." The silence that followed was deafening. In rooms like this, absent fathers were either dead war heroes or eccentric trust fund babies, traveling the world, not gambling addicts, who abandoned their families for Atlantic City poker tables. "Well," Evelyn said finally, "single mothers do such admirable work, though it must have been challenging for you, growing up without guidance in certain areas." Certain areas. Translation: I lacked the social breeding, the cultural knowledge, the inherent understanding of how their world operated. I was a feral cat invited to a dog show, and everyone could smell the difference. James excused himself to take a call from the hospital, leaving me alone with his parents for the first time. William retreated behind his newspaper like a turtle into his shell, but Evelyn saw opportunity. "Mia, dear, I hope you don't mind some motherly advice," she said, moving to sit beside me on the silk sofa. "James is such a special boy, so accomplished, so refined. He could have his pick of anyone's socialites, judges' daughters, women from families that understand his world." My stomach clenched, but I kept my expression neutral. "He's an amazing man." "He is. Which is why I worry sometimes about compatibility. When two people come from such different backgrounds, well, it can create challenges," misunderstandings, social difficulties that might impact his career. The threat was wrapped in concern, but it was unmistakably a threat. Date my son if you must, but don't expect to marry into this family without consequences. I understand your concerns, I said carefully, but James and I share the same values. We both believe in using our talents to help others. Evelyn's laugh was like ice cubes clinking in crystal. Values are lovely, dear, but they don't prepare you for hospital fundraisers or medical society dinners. They don't teach you which fork to use at the Union Club or how to navigate conversations about art acquisitions and summer homes. That's when I heard James's voice from the hallway, raised in frustration as he spoke to whoever was on the phone. Evelyn heard it too and rose to refill her martini, moving close enough to the doorway that she could monitor his conversation. I should have stayed seated, should have minded my own business. But something in Evelyn's predatory attention to her son's distress made me stand and move closer, close enough to hear what she was really listening for. Completely unacceptable, James was saying, his voice tight with anger. You can't just ambush her like that. She's not some business acquisition you can evaluate and dismiss. Darling, I'm simply looking out for your interests, came Evelyn's voice from the library extension phone. She'd been listening to his call all along, orchestrating whatever confrontation had upset him. My interests? Or your control issues? Don't be dramatic, James. This girl, this Mia, she's lovely, but she's not suitable for someone in your position. She'll hold you back socially, professionally. People will judge. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I pressed closer to the doorway, needing to hear every word of the conversation that was clearly about my future. I don't care what people think, James said. I care about her. She makes me happy. Happiness fades, darling, but social standing is forever. I've already spoken to Margaret Ashworth. Her daughter Caroline is back from her residency in Switzerland. Brilliant girl, proper background, understands our world. One dinner, that's all I ask. Just to remind you what compatibility actually looks like. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had disconnected. Then James's voice, cold as I'd never heard it. If you arrange anything like that, we're done. I mean it, Mother. Mia is the woman I'm going to marry, and you need to accept that. Over my dead body. The words were spoken so quietly, I almost missed them, but their venom was unmistakable. Evelyn Prescott wasn't just disapproving of her son's girlfriend, she was declaring war. I slipped back to the sofa, just as she returned to the room, her smile perfectly in place, despite the battle she'd just waged over a phone line. Everything all right? I asked innocently. Of course, dear, just family business. She settled back into her chair, studying me with the focus of a scientist examining a specimen. You know, Mia, I've been thinking, we should have you over for a proper dinner soon. A family gathering where you can meet everyone James's colleagues, his social circle. It would be so good for you to understand the world you're entering. The invitation sounded like a judge announcing a sentencing. The Prescott dining room that night looked like something from a movie set, crystal chandeliers casting rainbow prisms across bone china, silver gleaming against white linen, fresh orchids flown in from God knows where. 25 guests sat around the mahogany table like pieces in an elaborate chess game, each one positioned according to their social importance and net worth. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a simple black dress from Nordstrom, modest jewelry, the kind of understated elegance that wouldn't threaten anyone. I thought if I could just blend in, maybe I'd survive the evening without giving Evelyn ammunition for her campaign against me. I was so naive. The attack came during dessert, perfectly timed when conversations had grown loose with wine and everyone was feeling magnanimous. Evelyn rose from her seat at the head of the table, her champagne flute catching the light like a weapon. Before we conclude this lovely evening, she announced, her voice carrying that practiced authority that came from decades of commanding rooms like this, I'd like to share something with all of you. My stomach dropped. James reached for my hand under the table, his grip tight with warning. As you know, my son James has recently been appointed Chief of Pediatric Surgery, a position that requires not just medical excellence, but social acumen, the ability to navigate our world with grace and understanding. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Judge Hamilton nodded approvingly. Dr. Morrison raised his glass in salute. These were James's colleagues, his professional community, and Evelyn had them eating from her palm. Which is why I feel compelled to address something that's been concerning me, she continued, her gray eyes finding mine across the table like a sniper's scope. My son's choice in companionship. The room went silent. Even the servers froze, sensing blood in the water. Mia is a sweet girl, Evelyn said, her voice dripping with false kindness. She works at a small law firm as a paralegal, very industrious, very earnest. But I'm afraid she simply lacks the breeding, the sophistication, the fundamental worthiness required for someone in James's position. Heat flooded my face. Around the table, expressions ranged from embarrassment to barely concealed fascination. They were watching my public execution like it was dinner theater. She comes from humble circumstances, Evelyn continued, savoring every word. A diner waitress for a mother, no father to speak of, raised in a queen's walk-up. While there's nothing wrong with such backgrounds, we must be realistic about compatibility. James started to rise from his chair, his face flushed with rage, but I placed my hand on his arm, stopping him. Something had shifted inside me, a door slamming shut on years of accepting other people's judgment of my worth. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Prescott, I said, my voice steady despite the fire burning in my chest. We should be realistic about worth and compatibility. I reached into my purse with movements so calm and deliberate they seemed choreographed. The leather portfolio I withdrew was unmistakable to anyone in Manhattan's financial circles, the kind carried by people who made decisions worth millions. I've been thinking about that myself, I continued, opening the portfolio to reveal documents that made Uncle Richard lean forward despite himself, about what really determines someone's value in this world. The first document I placed on the white tablecloth was a patent certificate, official seal gleaming in the candlelight. This is patent number 7,924,581, filed 3 years ago for an algorithmic trading system that revolutionized high-frequency market analysis. Silence stretched across the table like a held breath. Dr. Morrison, who'd been smiling condescendingly moments before, was now squinting at the document with growing confusion. The patent was purchased by Goldman Sachs for $10 million, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned quiet. I was 29 years old at the time, the youngest person ever to receive that level of compensation for a financial algorithm. Evelyn's champagne flute began to tremble in her hand. Around the table, expressions shifted from pity to shock, to dawning recognition that they'd severely miscalculated who they were dealing with. But here's the interesting part, I continued, placing a second document beside the first. The algorithm has generated over $40 million in profits for Goldman in the past 3 years. They've offered to buy exclusive rights to any future innovations I develop. Judge Hamilton cleared his throat uncomfortably. Miss Carter, are you saying you're a millionaire? I'm saying that while Mrs. Prescott has spent the evening questioning my worthiness based on my mother's job and my zip code, I've been sitting here quietly, letting her embarrass herself. The room erupted in whispers. James was staring at me like he'd never seen me before, his expression cycling between amazement and something that might have been hurt. Why hadn't I told him? His eyes asked. Evelyn found her voice first, though it came out strained and desperate. This is ridiculous. You've been lying to all of us, deceiving my son, pretending to be something you're not. I've been exactly who I am, I replied evenly. A woman who chose to be valued for her character rather than her bank account. A woman who wanted to be loved for herself, not her assets. That's when my phone buzzed against my thigh. I ignored it at first, but the second buzz made me glance down. A text from my attorney, David Chen, who handled my business affairs with absolute discretion. The preview was enough to make my blood freeze. Prescott real estate documents obtained. You were right about the zoning violations. Call me immediately. I looked up to find Evelyn watching me with narrowed eyes, clearly trying to read the shift in my expression. What she didn't know was that when you have $10 million and excellent attorneys, you can afford to do very thorough background checks on people who declare war on you. Is there something else you'd like to share with us, Mia? She asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. I smiled, the expression sharp enough to cut crystal. Actually, Mrs. Prescott, I think we should have a private conversation. Just the two of us. I don't think that's necessary. Oh, I think it is. Especially considering what I've recently learned about your family's business practices. The color drained from Evelyn's face so completely she looked like a ghost. Around the table, people sensed another shift in the evening's power dynamics, conversations stopping mid-sentence as they tried to read the subtext passing between us. James looked between his mother and me, confusion written across his features. What's going on? What business practices? Why don't we let your mother explain? I suggested, never taking my eyes off Evelyn's increasingly panicked expression. I'm sure she'd love to tell everyone about the Riverside Development Project. The name hit her like a physical blow. Her champagne flute slipped from nerveless fingers, crystal exploding against the marble floor in a crash that echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. I think, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, that we should indeed have a private conversation. The private meeting had moved from the dining room to her sanctuary, a wood-paneled office that screamed old money and older secrets. James had followed us, despite his mother's protests, his jaw set with the kind of determination that meant he wasn't backing down. Charles Prescott brought up the rear, looking like a man walking to his own execution. I don't know what game you think you're playing, Evelyn said, settling behind her mahogany desk like a queen preparing for siege. But whatever little investigation you think you've conducted, Riverside Development Corporation, I interrupted, placing David Chen's folder on her pristine desk blotter. Ring a bell? The color drained from her face so completely she looked like she'd been carved from marble. Behind me, James shifted uncomfortably. What's Riverside Development? I opened the folder with deliberate precision, revealing documents that made Charles Prescott sink into the nearest chair like his legs had given out. Bank statements, property deeds, city planning documents, the paper trail of a decade-long scheme that had made the Prescotts rich while destroying lives. Your mother didn't inherit all this wealth, James, I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. She built it on the backs of families who couldn't fight back. The first document I placed on the desk was a zoning application from 2015, stamped with approvals that should never have been granted. Riverside Development specialized in buying rent-controlled apartment buildings in Queens and Brooklyn, buildings full of families who'd lived there for generations. Evelyn's hands were trembling now, but she tried to maintain her composure. Real estate development is perfectly legal, Mia. If you're trying to, legal maybe, ethical. I placed the next document down harder than necessary. Your company would buy buildings, then immediately file for zoning changes that forced out long-term tenants. Families with children, elderly people on fixed incomes, immigrants who didn't understand their rights. James was reading over my shoulder, his breathing becoming more labored with each page. Mom, what is this? What is she talking about? Once the buildings were empty, I continued, my voice gaining strength, Riverside would gut them and convert them to luxury condos. Profit margins of 400 to 500%. All perfectly legal, thanks to your connections with city planning officials. The smoking gun was a series of emails between Evelyn and a city councilman discussing mutually beneficial arrangements and appropriate considerations for cooperation. Bribes disguised as campaign contributions, favors traded for zoning approvals, a web of corruption that had displaced hundreds of families. This is. James's voice cracked as he read. Jesus, Mom, how could you do this? Don't you dare judge me, Evelyn snapped, her composure finally cracking completely. Your medical school, this house, your trust fund. Where do you think the money came from? Your father's salary? Hospital administrators don't make millions, James. But it was the final document that made my hands shake as I placed it on the desk. A tenant list from a building called Parkside Manor, dated 2018. 43 families had been evicted to make way for luxury development. And there, halfway down the list, was a name that made my world tilt sideways. Maria Santos, 64. Occupancy 12 years. My grandmother, I whispered, my voice barely audible. You evicted my grandmother. The silence that followed was deafening. James stared at the document like it was written in blood. Charles had gone completely pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Your grandmother lived in Parkside Manor, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. The building you bought in 2018. She was 64 years old, had lived there for 12 years, paid her rent on time every month. You forced her out with 60 days' notice so you could turn her one-bedroom apartment into luxury studios. Evelyn's mask finally slipped completely. That's business, Mia. Nothing personal. These people, they were holding back progress, keeping valuable property underutilized. These people were human beings with homes and lives and families. My voice was rising now, 3 years of suppressed rage finally finding its voice. My grandmother died 6 months after you evicted her. The stress, the upheaval, having to leave the neighborhood she'd known for decades, it killed her. James was staring at his mother like he'd never seen her before. Mom, is this true? Did you really? God, how many families did you displace? Hundreds, I answered before Evelyn could deflect. The documents show 47 buildings over 8 years. Conservative estimate? Nearly 2,000 people forced from their homes so your family could afford this penthouse and your collection of art. Charles finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. Evelyn, tell me you didn't know about the grandmother. Of course, I didn't know about every individual tenant, she snapped. That's what property managers are for. I couldn't personally investigate every... She had a name, I said, slamming my hand on the desk hard enough to make the crystal paperweight jump. Maria Santos. She raised 3 children in that apartment, including my mother. She taught me to make arroz con pollo in her tiny kitchen. She died alone in a nursing home in New Jersey because you decided her home was worth more without her in it. The room went completely silent except for the sound of James's labored breathing as he processed the magnitude of his family's crimes. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. How long have you known? He asked his mother. Known what? About Mia's grandmother. About what you did to her family. Evelyn's laugh was brittle as breaking glass. You think this is some elaborate coincidence? You think she just happened to fall in love with my son? Wake up, James. This whole relationship is revenge. She's been planning this from the beginning. That's not true, I said, but doubt was already creeping into James's expression. I didn't know about Riverside Development until after your mother declared war on me. I had David investigate your family's finances as a defensive measure. How convenient, Evelyn sneered. The poor little orphan girl just happened to be worth $10 million and just happened to fall in love with the son of the woman who destroyed her family. What are the odds? James was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not anger, but something worse. Uncertainty. After 3 years together, his mother had managed to plant a seed of doubt with a single accusation. James? I said quietly. You know me. You know who I am. Do I? He asked, and the question hit me like a physical blow. You've been hiding your wealth from me for 3 years, lying about who you are, what you can afford, letting me pay for dinners you could have bought the restaurant for. I hid my money to protect us from exactly this, I said desperately. From people who would see dollar signs instead of love. Or maybe you hid it because you were planning this all along, Evelyn interjected smoothly. The perfect revenge. Seduce the son, destroy the family from within. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Around us, the study felt smaller, more suffocating, the walls closing in as the family I'd hoped to join turned against me with the efficiency of a military operation. James stood slowly, his face pale as winter sky. I need time to think, to process all of this. James, please. Don't, he said, holding up his hand. Just don't. I need to understand what's real and what's been manipulation. He hadn't spoken since we left his mother's study 3 hours ago. Just sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, while I paced the small space like a caged animal. The silence stretched between us like a chasm I didn't know how to cross. Say something, I finally whispered, my voice cracking with exhaustion. Yell at me. Ask me questions. Anything is better than this. James looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. 3 years, Mia. 3 years of me worrying about money, about whether I could afford to take you to nice restaurants, about saving up for an engagement ring. And you've been sitting on $10 million the entire time. The accusation hit like a physical blow. I never asked you to pay for everything. I tried to split checks. With money you pretended to scrape together from a paralegal salary. His voice was flat, emotionless, which somehow hurt worse than anger. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? How small, how stupid. I sank into his desk chair, the same one where he'd studied for the MCATs while I brought him coffee and encouraged him through all-nighters. I was trying to protect us. From what? From me knowing the woman I love is successful? From me being proud of what you've accomplished? Tears burned my eyes as I tried to find words that would make him understand. From people like your mother. From being valued for what I have instead of who I am. From you questioning whether you loved me or my bank account. So you made that choice for me. James stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the manicured gardens of his childhood. You decided I couldn't handle the truth. That I was too shallow, too weak to love you regardless of your wealth. That's not. It is, Mia. That's exactly what you decided. He turned to face me, and the pain in his eyes was devastating. And maybe you were right. Maybe I would have treated you differently. Maybe I would have let you pay for things, relied on your money, become one of those men who marries up and loses himself in the process. The admission hung between us like a confession. In the distance, I could hear the grandfather clock in the foyer chiming the hour, each note echoing through the house like a funeral bell. I should have told you, I said quietly, after the first year, definitely after we started talking about marriage. I was scared, but that's not an excuse. James nodded slowly. And I should have stood up to my mother years ago. Should have set boundaries instead of letting her treat you like you weren't good enough for our family. A soft knock on the door interrupted us. James? Evelyn's voice was silk wrapped around steel. Darling, we need to discuss some things. Financial matters that require immediate attention. James's jaw tightened, but he opened the door to find his mother standing in the hallway wearing a cream-colored robe and the expression of someone who held all the cards. What financial matters? He asked wearily. Your trust fund, for starters. Your medical school loans that we forgave. The down payment on your apartment. The seed money for your research projects. Evelyn's voice was calm, reasonable, devastating. All of it tied to family expectations and family loyalty. The threat was unmistakable. Choose Mia, Lose everything. Are you seriously blackmailing your own son? I asked, standing to face her. I'm protecting my family from a manipulative gold digger who's been lying from day one. Evelyn's mask had slipped completely now, revealing the calculating woman beneath the society smile. James, darling, think carefully. This woman deceived you for 3 years. She investigated our family like we were criminals. She's been planning this confrontation from the moment she walked into our lives. That's not true, I said desperately, but I could see doubt creeping back into James's expression. I investigated you because you declared war on me, because you made it clear you'd do anything to get me out of your son's life. How convenient. The victim narrative. Evelyn stepped closer, her gray eyes cold as January morning. Tell me, Mia, when exactly did you discover that Riverside Development was connected to our family? Before or after you started dating James? The question was a trap, but I had to answer honestly. After. 6 months after your Christmas party, when you made it clear you'd never accept me. But you knew your grandmother had been evicted by a development company. I knew she'd been forced out of her apartment. I didn't know the details until David investigated. Evelyn smiled triumphantly. So you admit you came into this relationship with grievances against real estate developers, that you had motivation for revenge. I came into this relationship because I love your son, I said, my voice rising with frustration. Everything else came later. But the damage was done. James was looking at me like I was a stranger, doubt and pain warring in his expression. 3 years of love and trust, undermined by a master manipulator who knew exactly which buttons to push. James, Evelyn said softly, I know this is difficult, but think about what kind of marriage starts with this level of deception. What kind of woman builds a relationship on lies? That's when something inside me snapped. I'd spent my entire life being told I wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy, wasn't suitable for the spaces I wanted to occupy. I'd hidden my success, dimmed my light, made myself smaller to fit into other people's expectations. No more. You want to know what kind of woman I am? I said, stepping toward Evelyn with the confidence that came from having nothing left to lose. I'm the kind who pulled herself out of poverty through intelligence and determination, who created something valuable and chose to use her wealth responsibly instead of flaunting it, who protected the man she loved from his own mother's toxicity for 3 years. Evelyn's composure cracked slightly. How dare you? I'm not finished. My voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years commanding boardrooms and negotiating million-dollar deals. I'm also the kind of woman who won't let you destroy my relationship through manipulation and emotional blackmail, the kind who fights for what matters. I turned to James, my heart hammering against my ribs. I made mistakes. I kept secrets I shouldn't have kept. But I never lied about loving you, and I never used you for revenge or money or anything else your mother is suggesting. James stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. How do I know what's real anymore? How do I separate the woman I fell in love with from the stranger I discovered tonight? Because the woman you fell in love with is still here, I said simply. She just has more resources than you knew about. The silence stretched between us like a test. In the hallway, Evelyn waited with predatory patience, confident she'd driven the wedge deep enough to split us permanently. But as James looked into my eyes, something shifted. The doubt receded, replaced by recognition of the woman who'd brought him coffee during late-night study sessions, who'd listened to him talk about saving children's lives, who'd chosen him over a dozen men who knew about her wealth and pursued her because of it. I need time, he said finally. We both do, to figure out how to rebuild trust after this. It wasn't the declaration of love I'd hoped for, but it wasn't rejection either. It was honest, which was more than we'd had in years. Evelyn's face darkened as she realized her manipulation hadn't worked completely. James, if you choose this woman over your family, then I choose love over control, he said quietly. just like I should have done 3 years ago. As his mother retreated down the hallway, defeat written in the rigid line of her shoulders, James turned back to me. "We're going to need counseling," he said. "Real conversations about trust and secrets and money." "I know. And my mother is going to make our lives hell." "Let her try." For the first time in hours, James smiled. "The woman I fell in love with wouldn't back down from a fight, would she?" "Never," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. The call had come at 7 a.m. from investigative journalist Sarah Martinez, whose exposé on corrupt city officials had won her a Pulitzer 2 years earlier. David Chen had reached out to her after our confrontation, knowing that the Riverside development story was bigger than one family's vendetta. "The housing crisis angle makes this front-page material," Sarah had explained over coffee that morning. "Displacement, gentrification, political corruption, it's everything our readers care about. Plus, the human interest element of your grandmother's story." Now, waiting for the elevator that would take me to the newsroom where my former tormentor's crimes would be laid bare, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The absolute certainty that I was doing the right thing. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Meeting ran long. Are you sure about this?" I typed back. "Never been more sure of anything." The elevator doors opened to reveal Evelyn Prescott herself, immaculate as always in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her face went white when she saw me, then flushed red as she realized where we were. "Going up?" I asked pleasantly, stepping aside to make room. "What are you doing here?" she hissed as the doors closed, trapping us in 10 floors of uncomfortable proximity. "Research journalism. You should try it sometime. Very illuminating." Evelyn's composure cracked completely. "You can't do this. You'll destroy innocent people, James's reputation, his career." "James's career is built on saving children's lives, not on dirty real estate money," I interrupted. "And as for innocent people, tell that to my grandmother. Tell that to the Gonzalez family, evicted from their home of 15 years. Tell that to Mrs. Chen, who died of a heart attack 2 weeks after you forced her out of the building where she'd raised 4 children." The elevator stopped at the 8th floor, and Evelyn grabbed my arm with desperate strength. "What do you want? Money? I can write you a check right now. 10 million, 20 million, whatever it takes." "I don't want your money, Evelyn." I pulled free from her grip, my voice steady as granite. "I want justice. Please." The word came out cracked, broken, nothing like the imperious woman who'd called me unworthy 3 nights earlier. "I'll apologize publicly. I'll welcome you into the family. I'll do whatever you want. But please don't destroy us." The elevator doors opened to reveal the Times newsroom, dozens of reporters hunched over computers, phones ringing, the controlled chaos of democracy in action. Sarah Martinez stood near the reception desk, professional smile in place, recording equipment already set up in a nearby conference room. "Actually," I said, stepping into the hallway, "there is something you can do." Evelyn followed me like a woman walking to her execution. "Name it." I pulled a folder from my briefcase, documents I'd had David prepare that morning. The Riverside Community Restoration Fund, $50 million dedicated to rebuilding the neighborhoods your company destroyed. Affordable housing, community centers, small business loans for displaced families. Her face went ashen. 50 million? That's most of our liquid assets. It's also less than half of what Riverside Development profited from destroying people's homes, I replied evenly. Consider it paying back what you stole, with interest. And if I agree to this? Then I tell Miss Martinez that the Prescott family has chosen to make amends privately. The story dies here. Evelyn stared at the contract like it was a death warrant. Around us, the newsroom hummed with activity, other stories breaking, other truths being exposed, the machinery of accountability grinding forward. I need time to liquidate assets, arrange transfers. You have 24 hours. After that, tomorrow's front page will be very uncomfortable reading for you. That's when James appeared in the elevator lobby, still in surgical scrubs, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it. He took in the scene, his mother looking defeated, me holding contracts, Sarah Martinez waiting with barely concealed anticipation. "What's happening here?" he asked. "Your girlfriend is blackmailing us," Evelyn said bitterly. "Your mother is paying back the families she displaced," I corrected. Voluntarily. James looked between us, processing the implications. "The community restoration fund we talked about? $50 million worth of making amends," I confirmed. "Or a very public accounting of where the Prescott fortune really came from." Evelyn turned to her son with desperate eyes. "James, darling, you can't let her do this. Think about your career, your reputation, your future." "I am thinking about my future," James said quietly. "And it's with someone who fights for justice, not someone who profits from other people's suffering." He stepped closer to me, his presence solid and reassuring in the chaos of the moment. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing," I said, meaning it completely. "This isn't about us anymore. It's about doing what's right." Evelyn looked at her son with something approaching panic. "You're choosing her over your family, over everything we've built." "I'm choosing love over greed," James replied. "I'm choosing the values you should have taught me, instead of the money you made betraying them." The conference room door opened, and Sarah Martinez approached with professional courtesy and predatory instincts. "Miss Carter, we're ready for you." I looked at Evelyn one last time, this woman who'd spent 3 years trying to convince me I wasn't worthy of her world. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Justice served privately or justice served publicly." "You've won," she said bitterly. "You've destroyed everything." "I've exposed everything," I corrected. "You destroyed it yourself the moment you decided that poor people's homes were worth less than rich people's profits." As James and I walked toward the conference room where truth would either be negotiated or broadcasted, I felt his hand find mine, warm and steady and claiming. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back to the way things were." "Good," I said, squeezing his fingers. "The way things were sucked?" For the first time in days, James laughed, really laughed, the sound echoing through the newsroom, like a promise of better days ahead. The wire transfer confirmations appeared on my laptop screen like digital justice numbers that represented homes rebuilt, families relocated back to neighborhoods they'd been forced to abandon, dreams given second chances. David Chen had worked through the night to ensure every legal detail was ironclad, every dollar accounted for. "It's done," I told James, who was pacing my small living room like a caged animal. He'd barely slept, torn between relief that his family's crimes would remain private and guilt over the years of willful blindness that had made this moment necessary. "Jesus," he breathed, sinking onto my second-hand couch. "Mom actually did it. She liquidated everything." My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Martinez. "Story killed per your request. But I'm keeping all the documentation. If they renege on the fund, we go to print immediately." "Your mother is many things," I said, closing the laptop, "but she's not stupid. She knows this is her only chance at redemption." That afternoon, I drove to the old Parkside Manor site where my grandmother had lived for 12 years before Riverside Development destroyed her world. The luxury condos that had replaced her building gleamed in the afternoon sun, each unit worth more than my grandmother had earned in her entire working life. But now there was a sign posted on the construction fence across the street. "Future site of the Maria Santos Community Center coming fall 2024. I'd named it for my grandmother, the woman who'd raised my mother with nothing but love and determination, who died believing her worth was measured by other people's judgment. The center would provide after-school programs, adult education classes, and technology training for families rebuilding their lives. "She would have been proud," said a voice behind me. I turned to find Evelyn Prescott standing on the sidewalk, looking smaller somehow in the bright daylight. She wore jeans the first time I'd ever seen her in anything casual, and her perfect composure had given way to something that looked almost human. Mrs. Prescott. I kept my voice neutral, unsure whether this was an ambush or an olive branch. I came to apologize, she said simply. Not because of the money or the fund or any of that, but because I was wrong about you. Completely, utterly wrong. The admission hung between us like a flag of surrender. In the distance, construction workers were breaking ground for another community project, the sound of jackhammers mixing with children's laughter from a nearby playground. I spent 3 years trying to convince myself that you weren't good enough for James, Evelyn continued, when the truth was, I wasn't good enough to be your mother-in-law. You were protecting what you thought was important, I said carefully. I was protecting my own sense of superiority, she corrected. My belief that worth came from bloodlines and bank accounts instead of character and compassion. We stood in silence, watching workers prepare the foundation for a building that would serve hundreds of families like the one Evelyn's company had displaced, like the one I'd grown up in. The scholarship program you announced yesterday, she said eventually. The tech training for underprivileged kids. How can I help? I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas. But all I saw was genuine remorse and something that might have been respect. Are you sure you want to help? It won't be glamorous charity work. No galas or photo opportunities. Just showing up and doing the work. I've had enough photo opportunities, Evelyn said dryly. Maybe it's time I tried actually earning my place in the world. 6 months later, I stood in the restored community center that bore my grandmother's name, watching Evelyn Prescott teach a coding class to 12-year-olds who'd never owned computers before. She was patient with their questions, encouraging with their mistakes, completely transformed from the woman who'd once called me unworthy. Miss Prescott, called out Marcus, a kid from the Bronx whose family had been relocated through our housing program, this algorithm stuff is hard. The best things usually are, Marcus, she replied, adjusting his code with gentle guidance. But look what you've built already. That's not easy work. James appeared beside me, wedding ring catching the afternoon light as he wrapped his arm around my waist. We'd married 2 weeks earlier, in a small ceremony at the community center, surrounded by families we'd helped and friends who'd supported us through the storm. Think she's really changed? He asked quietly. People can surprise you, I said, watching his mother high-five Marcus as his program finally ran successfully. Even people you think you know completely. The scholarship program had grown beyond my wildest expectations. 24 kids in its first year, all from families that had been displaced by gentrification, all learning skills that could change their trajectories forever. Some would become programmers, others would start their own companies, a few might even create algorithms that revolutionize entire industries. My grandmother would have loved this, I said, watching children who looked like I had at their age discovering that their minds could be their tickets out of poverty. She would have loved you, James corrected. The woman who refused to let anyone else define her worth. As the coding class ended and kids ran to show their parents what they'd learned, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From the walk-up in Queens to the penthouse confrontation to this moment of building something meaningful from the wreckage of old prejudices. Worth, I'd finally learned, wasn't something other people could give or take away. It was something you claimed for yourself. Something you proved through your choices, something you built with your own hands and heart. The girl from Queens had grown into a woman who understood that true power wasn't about having money or status or family connections. True power was using whatever resources you had to lift others up, to fight for justice, to refuse to accept that anyone was disposable or unworthy. And maybe, just maybe, that was a lesson even the Prescott family could learn. As James and I walked home through the neighborhood where my grandmother had once lived, where families were now rebuilding their lives with dignity and hope, I realized something profound. The woman who'd been called unworthy had become exactly who she was meant to be. The ceremony was nothing like the society wedding Evelyn had probably envisioned for her son. No cathedral, no orchestra, no guest list that read like Forbes magazine. Just folding chairs arranged on a gymnasium floor, decorations made by the kids from our after-school program, and a potluck reception where Miss Chen brought her famous dumplings and Marcus's mom contributed 3 different kinds of mac and cheese. James looked at me like I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, even though my dress came from a boutique in Astoria rather than a designer showroom. When he slipped my grandmother's simple gold band onto my finger, the one piece of jewelry she'd managed to keep through every hardship, I felt her presence so strongly it took my breath away. "You did good, mija," I could almost hear her whisper. "You did real good." The moment that broke me completely came during the ceremony itself. As James and I exchanged vows, we'd written ourselves promises about choosing each other every day, about building something honest and true together. I saw Evelyn in the 3rd row, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. Not tears of disappointment or social embarrassment, but something deeper, recognition maybe. Understanding of what love actually looked like when it wasn't performing for an audience or trying to meet someone else's expectations. After the ceremony, as guests mingled over homemade cake and celebration, Evelyn approached me with the kind of nervous energy I'd never seen from her before. "Mia," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, "I wanted to give you something." She handed me a small velvet box, worn around the edges from age. Inside was a simple silver locket, tarnished but beautiful, with an inscription I had to squint to read. "For my daughter, with all my love." Manuscription, my breath caught in my throat. This was my grandmother's. She was wearing it the day you evicted her. "I know," Evelyn said quietly. "I had the property management company return all personal effects to me. I've been keeping it, waiting for the right moment to." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Waiting for the right moment to what?" "To prove I wasn't the monster you thought I was," she admitted. "But keeping it all these years probably just proves I was exactly that monster, wasn't I?" I studied the locket, remembering how my grandmother would touch it absently while she cooked, how it would catch the light when she laughed at my childhood jokes. The fact that it had been sitting in Evelyn's jewelry box all this time, while I mourned not having anything tangible left of her, was almost too much to process. "Why now?" I asked. "Because you've taught me something I thought I already knew but clearly didn't," Evelyn said, her voice growing stronger. "Worth isn't inherited, it's earned. It's proven through actions, through choices, through how you treat people when nobody's watching." She gestured around the community center, where kids from the coding program were teaching dance moves to bemused investment bankers, where families displaced by her company's greed were sharing tables with the surgeon who'd married their champion. "You could have destroyed us completely," she continued. "Could have taken everything and left us with nothing, the way we left your grandmother with nothing. Instead, you chose justice over revenge. Healing over hatred." I fastened the locket around my neck, feeling the weight of my grandmother's love settling against my heart. I chose what she would have chosen. She taught me that how you respond to cruelty says everything about who you are. "And how you've responded says everything about who you've become," Evelyn said. "The woman who was worthy of my son all along, even when I was too blind to see it." 6 months later, I stood in the same gymnasium, now transformed into a graduation ceremony for our first class of coding students. 24 kids who'd started the program not knowing a processor from a printer were now presenting apps they'd designed to solve problems in their own communities. Marcus had created a translation app to help his grandmother communicate with her doctors. Aisha had built a budgeting tool for families transitioning from shelters to permanent housing. Each project was a testament to what became possible when you gave people resources instead of judgment, opportunity instead of pity. "These kids remind me of someone I used to know," James whispered in my ear, as we watched them demonstrate their work to an audience of proud parents and potential employers. "Who's that?" "A brilliant woman from Queens who refused to let anyone tell her she wasn't smart enough, good enough, or worthy enough to change the world." As I looked around that room filled with hope and possibility, I realized something that would have shocked the 22-year-old who'd first sold her algorithm in secret. The money had never been the real power. The real power was in choosing to lift others up instead of keeping them down, in building bridges instead of walls, in refusing to let other people's definitions of worth become your reality. The truth is, we all have moments when someone tries to tell us we're not enough. Not smart enough, not successful enough, not wealthy enough, not connected enough to deserve the life we want or the love we've found. But here's what I learned in that dining room where Evelyn called me unworthy, and what I hope you'll remember the next time someone tries to diminish your value. Your worth isn't up for debate. It's not determined by your bank account, or your zip code, or your family tree. It's proven by your choices, your character, your willingness to stand up for what's right even when it's hard. Real family, the kind that matters, isn't about sharing DNA. It's about showing up for each other, believing in each other, refusing to let each other face the world's judgment alone. Sometimes that family is the one you're born into, and sometimes it's the one you build from strangers who become sisters, mentors who become mothers, communities that become home. The woman who was once called unworthy had become exactly who she was meant to be, someone who understood that true worth comes from lifting others up, not from tearing them down. Have you ever had to prove your worth to someone who underestimated you? Have you learned that the most important validation is the kind you give yourself? How do you balance forgiveness with protecting your dignity? How do you choose healing over hatred when someone has hurt you deeply? If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been told you weren't good enough for the life you wanted, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about finding your voice. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're enough, exactly as they are. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let other people's limitations become your own.